Now this is what Little Wars TV is all about. Visiting the great battle sites of the world, and it's just our luck that this week we get to go to the romantic South Pacific.
We're in a pool in Pennsylvania.
No, we're not. This is the Solomon Islands. We're enjoying the weather. There's palm trees.
They're inflatable.
Welcome to Little Wars TV. Ignore my friend here and join us this week as we tackle one of my favorite subjects to wargame, surface naval combat in the Pacific during World War II.
This week we'll be talking about the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, debate whether better command of the American ships could have mitigated some of their losses. Then our club will refight this savage night engagement in 1/2400 scale on the tabletop.
And for the first time ever on Little Wars TV, we're going to be taking the gaming outdoors so we can enjoy the island breeze and smell the scent of coconut on the air.
We're on your mother-in-law's farm. All I smell is manure. I'm out of here.
Is this better?
Much.
I'm Steve and I'm here with Tom at the United States Naval Academy, and you're here with us on Little Wars TV, where we don't just talk about history, we game it out on the tabletop. Ever since I was a kid and played the classic Avalon Hill board game Midway, I've been fascinated with naval combat in World War II in the Pacific, particularly what took place in the months following that astonishing victory.
It really is a fascinating part of the war. While Midway was where the U.S. Navy halted the Japanese advance across the Pacific, it was the Solomon Islands campaign in the latter half of 1942, where the Allies got the tides of war flowing the other way.
Some have even gone so far as to say the Solomons campaign is where the U.S. Navy learned to fight in World War II. I think that's a bit of a stretch for the naval aviators who cut their teeth at Coral Sea and Midway, but I think it's absolutely true for the surface combat commanders.
Right. The campaign has a lot of intense surface battles. So why start with the first naval battle of Guadalcanal?
Well, the answer is pretty simple, really, because it encapsulates in one engagement a lot of the different challenges that commanders had during the engagements at this time. Surface battles at this point in the war were typically moonlit affairs that had enemy fleets sailing quietly towards each other until one finally spotted the other. Then the night would explode into thunderous exchanges of gunfire and torpedoes that often left both sides in a state of total confusion. First Guadalcanal also resulted in some notable casualties too, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about the outcome of the battle, maybe we should talk a little bit about what led up to it.
The Solomons campaign really began 3 months before our battle, when U.S. Marines stormed Guadalcanal and seized the airstrip that would become Henderson Field.
The Japanese responded only 2 days later, when, under cover of darkness, they surprised the Allies in nearby Savo Sound, soon to be renamed Ironbottom Sound.
There was plenty of finger pointing afterwards, but one of the interesting angles from our perspective was the blame that commanders put on their new radar technology. While the United States was well ahead of Japan in the deployment of radar on fighting ships, the technology was still in its infancy. Because of this, naval commanders were just as likely to overestimate radar's capabilities as they were to underestimate them. This would have a real cost in the upcoming Solomons campaign.
In the 3 months following the disaster at Savo Island, the campaign descended into a bloody stalemate.
One of the few bright spots was the Battle of Cape Esperance in October of '42.
And the building behind us right here is named after the commander of the United States forces that night. Hailing from Indianapolis, Rear Admiral Norman Scott played a key role in introducing intercollegiate swimming to the Naval Academy while a midshipman here at Annapolis, making the naming of this natatorium a fitting tribute. As he rose up the ranks, Scott impressed pretty much everyone with his dedication to combat training in all conditions, something that really came in handy off of Cape Esperance.
That's right, and it certainly endeared him to the new commander in the South Pacific area, Admiral William Bull Halsey.
Halsey's approach couldn't be more different than his predecessors. Rather than sit back, fight defensively, and just try to hold on to Guadalcanal, he vowed to take the fight to the enemy.
That's right. When the U.S. Navy caught wind that the Japanese were planning to attack in mid-November, Halsey vowed to meet them head-on.
The problem was the Allied surface combat fleet was badly outgunned at this point, and while the Japanese were believed to be committing as many as 4 battleships to this operation, all the U.S. Navy could throw back at them was a force centered around cruisers.
Sounds like a perfect job for Admiral Norman Scott.
You would think so, except Scott was relegated to second in command for this operation under Rear Admiral Dan Callaghan. Now, by all accounts, Dan Callaghan was a fine sailor, but he had risen to his position primarily on the strengths of his administrative skills. In fact, his most recent posting had been Chief of Staff to Halsey's predecessor, and the only reason he was available for this mission was because of the change in command. Given the fight ahead, there was no reason to think that Callaghan was a better choice to command than Scott.
So why was he put in charge?
Well, he had 15 days of seniority.
Okay.
This choice would end up having real consequences.
Just after 1 a.m. on November 13th, with the moon obscured by clouds, the two opposing forces approached each other just north of Guadalcanal. Admiral Callaghan arranged his 8 destroyers and 5 cruisers into 3 separate divisions, but had them all steam in a single column. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Hiroki Abe commanded 11 Japanese destroyers, 1 light cruiser and 2 battleships, the Hiei and the Kirishima. He split them into 4 divisions, each operating at a distance from each other.
Heavily outgunned, the Americans did have 2 advantages: surprise and radar. Unfortunately, Callaghan pretty much threw the latter one of those away when he took the ships that had the best radar sets and put them at the rear of their respective divisions. As a result, he didn't get a complete picture of just what he was facing until the opposing forces were only 10,000 yards apart. Even then, he became so caught up in trying to maintain his ship's formation that he didn't give them permission to open fire until they were practically on top of the enemy.
I know you think things would have gone differently if Scott had been in command that night, but can we really say that Callaghan's handling of his ships mattered? The Japanese didn't spot the Americans until just before they opened fire. Additionally, the Americans had 5-inch guns. It's not clear they would have been able to penetrate the battleships unless they were up close.
Those are all fair points, but with Callaghan giving often contradictory orders during the battle, gunnery and maneuver discipline evaporated almost instantaneously, resulting in some incidents of friendly fire. The most tragic of these came when Callaghan's own flagship, the cruiser San Francisco, inadvertently hit the light cruiser Atlanta, killing, among many others, Rear Admiral Norman Scott. I truly believe that if Scott had been in command, the American performance would have been much less confused and much more effective.
Perhaps, but if the fault for the confusion lay at Callaghan's feet, he paid the ultimate price for it. Not long after Scott died, the San Francisco came under murderous fires that sailed between the 2 Japanese battleships, killing Callaghan.
Scott and Callaghan were the only 2 U.S. admirals killed in surface combat in the war, and they died within minutes of each other. After 40 minutes of combat, both sides decided they had had enough and decided to disengage. If you factor in ships lost during the fight or in the aftermath the next day, the Americans outright lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, with additional ships knocked out for weeks or even months. One of the cruisers lost was the light cruiser Juno. She was badly damaged in the fight and was limping to safety hours later when she was torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine. Among those killed were the 5 Sullivan brothers from Waterloo, Iowa. Decades later, their story would become a source of inspiration for the Steven Spielberg blockbuster Saving Private Ryan. By comparison, the Japanese only lost 2 destroyers and the Hiei, making it a tactical loss for the Americans, but maybe a strategic win, because after all, the Japanese didn't bombard Guadalcanal, and they weren't able to send in the reinforcements that had been planned. You ready to refight the first naval battle of Guadalcanal?
Absolutely.
Well, let's head back to the South Pacific then.
Oh Lord, not that again.
What the hell are we doing here? We're wargamers. We don't like fresh air and sunshine.
I would have thought that you'd appreciate an all-expense-paid trip to the beautiful South Pacific.
Stop. Please. Stop.
Fine. Gentlemen, this is your battlefield for today. Ironbottom Sound, just north of Guadalcanal.
Did you forget the miniatures?
I did not. Since this is a night action, and who spots who first is going to be critical to the outcome, we're going to actually use pre-programmed patrol routes that you'll come up with away from the table. I'll cross-reference, and when one side spots the other, I'll put the miniatures on the table.
Will that spotting include radar detection for the Americans?
Absolutely. It's critical for this engagement, and for today we're going to be using the rule set General Quarters 3 from Old Dominion Gameworks, and they have rules regarding radar spotting in night actions that are perfect for scenarios like this. In my mind, General Quarters 3 offers the perfect balance of playability and simulation, making it the best World War II miniatures rule set out there. If you'd like to learn more about it, be sure to check out Little Wars TV next week when we post our rules review about it. All right, so we've already divided up the sides. Greg, Brian, you're going to be the Imperial Japanese Navy, while Tom and Tony, you're going to be the U.S. Navy. The Japanese will enter at this end of the table, and their goal is to bombard Henderson Field and make sure the path is clear for troop transports following behind. For the U.S. Navy, you'll start somewhere at the other end of the table. You know the Japanese are coming, and you need to turn them back.
How are you handling the element of surprise here? After all, being able to catch the Japanese at unawares was the main advantage the Americans had.
Absolutely, it's very important to this scenario, and I am not going to reveal them now, but I do have some rules that I'm confident will leave the Japanese very unsettled once we get started. Speaking of getting started, why don't we head to our pre-battle briefings? Actually, before we get to the briefings, let me tell you about the rules that I've worked in here to simulate the kind of surprise that the Japanese experienced during the actual engagement. First of all, our Japanese forces are not going to be able to fire armor-piercing shells for their first 3 rounds of fire. That means those huge battleships, they're not going to be nearly as effective as they would have been if they had been able to fire armor-piercing shells right off the bat. Second, and this goes to the players, Greg and Brian know this, but they're really going to be the United States, not the Japanese. Meanwhile, Tom and Tony, who don't know this, are going to find out that they're the Japanese at the very last second before we start the game. No planning, they have to go with the historical disposition. I'm hoping that while it's not going to be a complete surprise that they're going to run into the US, it leaves them a little bit uncomfortable going into this game.
Well, my naval prowess in our wargaming club is pretty well known.
It is.
So I'm going to focus on mixing up the next batch of Mai Tais.
It's a fantastic idea.
And I'm basically going to let you handle the tactical plan. So what do you think?
Okay, so we know the history of what happened here, so we're not going to make some of the mistakes that the Americans historically made. We're going to put our ships with the better radar in front. I think the acquisition phase, in their first couple turns, are going to be what wins or loses this game. So I want to go in fast and hot with our destroyers. At flank speed all the way in, maybe 2 divisions in line. Once we find them and maneuver ourselves in a position where we can launch a torpedo attack and hope to God it works. And as soon as we launch those attacks and fire the guns as close as we can, 90-degree turn,
we
pop
bail.
smoke, and haul ass.
Tom and Tony provided the best pre-battle discussion ever filmed for Little Wars TV. But since they're really going to be the Japanese, there's really no reason to show it to you. So let's get on with the game. Because neither side's ships start on the table, and the 2 forces approach unseen, I had Greg and Brian pre-plot the US Navy's initial movement on graph paper and then give their sheets to me to resolve spotting. In doing so, they split from a historical deployment and divided into multiple divisions for their approach. For the Japanese, well, I continued to let poor Tom and Tony believe that they were the Americans and plot something, but in reality, I already had the historical deployment and path of travel for the Japanese forces to work with. Once I had both sets of plots, it was up to me to compare them, consult GQ3's radar and nighttime visual acquisition charts, and roll to see who spotted who first. As expected, the American radar gave them a fix on the Japanese positions first, but it was still a little outside of visual range. That meant placing unmarked poker chips on the table instead of miniatures. It also meant it was finally time to let Tom and Tony in on our little surprise. Alright, so we're a few turns in here. The forces are about 16,000 yards from each other, and the American vessels have detected with their superior radar the Japanese coming in 3 separate columns that they can identify. Currently I've got marked on the table 2 columns for United States forces. They can't be seen by the Japanese yet, but at this point the Americans will be able to change their movements to respond to what the Japanese do on their pre-plotted movement. Now guys, you might have realized that, hey, you only plotted 1 column. Why are the Americans coming in 2 columns? Well, that's because actually you guys are the Japanese in this scenario. You're finding that out now. They've known that they're going to be the US Navy for a while now, and you have to come in your historical deployment.
I don't play the Japanese, Steve.
You do today! With the big reveal complete, both sides continued to close distance, each hoping to be the first to gain visual acquisition and the ability to open fire that went along with it. As commander of the lead division of U.S. destroyers, Brian followed his pregame plan and rushed his tin cans headlong towards the central Japanese column. Unfortunately, Japanese night vision proved superior, forcing him to reveal his vessels first. With targets acquired, Tom wastes no time opening fire with the 2 destroyers and light cruiser leading his middle column. But the Japanese gunners struggle to find their range and simply soak the sailors aboard the USS O'Bannon with water from nearby splashes. Over the next few minutes of action, the Americans continually fail in their efforts to get a visual fix on their opponent. Meanwhile, the Japanese begin to land the occasional hit. While none of them are particularly serious, the bigger problem is that any advantage Brian and Greg may have enjoyed as a result of their early radar detection has clearly slipped away. Finally, the Americans start to get a look at just what they're up against, but that glimpse carries a steep cost. Not only does Tom continue to pour on gunfire from his middle column, but he also launches torpedoes from his destroyers on the western side of the table. Meanwhile, Tony is more than happy to do the same from the east. The effects are devastating, and in an instant, 2 of Brian's destroyers are blown out of the water, while the O'Bannon is racked by gunfire hits. Brian's charge up the center is beginning to turn into an absolute disaster. Before Tom and Tony can get too pleased with themselves, however, they're forced to confront the uncomfortable fact that once launched, torpedoes can't tell friend from foe.
Oh no.
That's a hit with the potential for another.
Oh good.
Let's see. That's horizontal.
All it takes is 1.
No.
Friendly fire.
Sorry, man.
That's all good.
Much like the historical engagement, our battle quickly devolves into a confused, short-range knife fight. With ships sailing so close to each other, and GQ3 utilizing pre-plotted but simultaneously executed movement, the potential for a collision is sky high. And sure enough, 2 destroyers in the middle of the fight, Brian's O'Bannon and Tom's Harasame, end up far too close for comfort. While the Harasame survives the collision, the beleaguered O'Bannon is finally foundering. And with half the battle over, and having already lost 3 destroyers in exchange for no meaningful damage inflicted on the enemy, what was already a tough mission for the US Navy is starting to look impossible.
Well, I'd say that we're off to a great start.
Yeah.
Great or really great?
Really great.
Really great.
Really. Things are happening.
Yeah,
Things are
to us.
Things are happening.
Specifically, yes. Now that our first destroyer squadron got pretty much wrecked, we don't have anything that's close to the Japanese battleships, so I think the Japanese players have done a really good job at sort of positioning their own destroyers to shield the main battleship. So at the moment, I'm not really sure how we're going to get in there, which is a problem. So
yeah, and the extra distance that the Japanese can shoot is a major factor.
Obviously, we were surprised. Turns out we were the Japanese Navy, not the American Navy.
That was a surprise, yes.
But I was okay with that, given the assets we bring to bear. And so far, it started off pretty well, I think.
Well, I got to tell you, being torpedoed by my fellow Japanese admiral has kind of put a damper on my plans. I've suffered no damage from the Americans. Unfortunately, I have 2 ships crippled as a result of being hit by long lance torpedoes.
Well, you know, it's a confusing melee out there.
Evidently.
And, you know, you have my apologies for that, but there's more ships to run.
It's now or never for the Americans, and they decide to push the attack on both flanks. That immediately works to their advantage on the eastern side as Brian's cruiser division starts to land some brutal hits on Tony's heavily outgunned destroyers. On the western side of the table, Greg is in a little bit more of a pickle, as his destroyer division is outnumbered by Tom's tin cans. Just as in the center, this fight becomes a point-blank range exchange of gunfire, torpedo launches, and almost a second collision. Speaking of the center, Brian's lone remaining destroyer, the USS Sterret, is left to take on 2 Japanese battleships on its own. A torpedo spread is ineffective, and gunfire only lands a single hit on Admiral Abe's flagship, the battleship Hiei, but what a hit it is. Unbeknownst to the Americans, that single 5-inch shell from the Sterret bursts on the Hiei's bridge, killing Admiral Abe. While the Sterret quickly pays for its heroics, becoming the last member of its division to slip beneath the waves, the fortunes of war are about to fall on the side of the US Navy once again, and in a big way.
Well, things have been going bad, but I did have some torpedoes in the water from a previous turn, and a Japanese battleship sailed right into the sweet spot, landed 2 torpedo hits. Of course, because we're American, one of the 2 was a dud, but we got 1 hit on this battleship.
This is a massive blow to the Japanese. Having already lost an admiral, the loss of his battleship is now a real possibility. For the first time in the fight, the Japanese begin to consider if disengaging might be the best option. Extricating themselves won't be easy, however. The destroyer fight on the western side of the table between Greg and Tom continues unabated. Meanwhile, on the eastern side of the table, Brian and Tony are launching torpedoes at each other and lighting up the night with gunfire and searchlights. It's at this moment that the brief period of American luck appears to run out. A pair of Japanese torpedoes launched from Tony's destroyers crash into Admiral Scott's flagship, the Atlanta, blasting her in two and sending both she and Admiral Scott to the depths of Ironbottom Sound. This catastrophic loss is enough to convince the Americans to try and break off the fight as well. Well, we're at the end of about 30 minutes in battle time, and both sides have indicated, I think, that you're ready to break off, so I think we'll call it at this point.
Okay.
Admiral,
Good game.
well done. Sir?
Admiral. Well, after a really rough start, it actually got a lot better in the second half of the game.
For you.
For me.
For you. Things could have gone a little better for my destroyers, but I guess I get a moral victory for killing Admiral Abe. The Atlanta got sunk, but the Juno did some good damage, so...
Yeah, looking back at it, I mean, I don't know what we really would have done differently except not get ravaged by torpedoes in the first 2 turns.
Right, yeah.
I mean, being outgunned the way we were by the Japanese battleships, we had to stay a certain distance away, and we largely did do that. But I guess losing all those destroyers and losing the better of our 2 admirals probably was not a good way to end the day.
Yeah, should not have been as aggressive.
No, I think it's that first turn was just fearsome. I think we did most of the damage there, despite also doing some fraternal damage.
It happens. We did that first turn of engagement. We were at very close range. Both sides, I think, were somewhat taken aback by how close it was, and it was vicious. The fire back and forth, the torpedo attacks. That set the tone for, I think, what happened the rest of the game.
Yeah. Over here, I mean, after the initial, there's a big destroyer skirmish for most of the game. Lots of damage here and there. The high EA at the end, the torpedo did quite a bit of damage to the hull structure, and one of the shots from the Sterret took out Admiral Abe. So those 3 moments are certainly definitive for the fate of the high EA.
I think what we've ended up with at the end of this game is a historical result, or at least pretty close to it. The Japanese, you've lost only 2 destroyers on the tabletop, but some of your others have been chewed up. And we have a light cruiser, the Nagara, that's had its engines knocked out, and it's not going to be able to sail back up the slot. Similar problem for the Hiei, just like the historical ship as well. It's taken some serious damage from the torpedo hit, and Admiral Abe was killed by that shot from the Sterret pretty early on in the game. So not only has that been enough to turn the Japanese back, but it also is possibly going to result in the loss of a battleship and a light cruiser tomorrow once the Cactus Air Force gets up in the air over Henderson. On the American side, you've lost the Atlanta, an anti-aircraft cruiser, and perhaps most importantly, Admiral Scott, who was on board. So he dies again today here with us. And you've also lost an entire division's worth of destroyers, despite the heroics of the Sterret.
Heroes all.
So looking at how to assess this, I think the Japanese maybe did a little worse than they did historically, and the Americans did a little better than they did historically.
So we won.
No. No, I think I still have to call it a perhaps minor Japanese victory because they did inflict more damage, even though they weren't able to get through to Henderson Field.
But no punishment today, since that was not mentioned in the early part of the episode, and
Gentlemen, abandoned ship!
Admiral, it was an honor.
It was.
Sort of.
Woo! Refreshing?
It's brisk. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very brisk. Lost my leg. Well, thanks for watching Little Wars TV. We'll see you next week. Don't forget to check back next week for our bonus videos.
Salty.
That's it from the South Pacific.